Hashem lo yivne bayis, shalom levoy naboy, Hashem lo yishmari, shav shokat shoymai, Hashem lo yivne bayis, shalom levoy naboy, Hashem lo yishmari, shav shokat shoymai.
Welcome back, my favorite Tzaddikim and Chassidim. As always, I hope you're doing well. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the same doctrine of the inner temple, yet again, as this is part of the series. This is, so far, video number 6. Who knows how the playlist will get messed up in future years, but it's video number 6 currently. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the number of heavens and the number of heavenly temples. And so why is this important? And it's because, as we'll see, the idea or the discussion, the debate surrounding how many heavens there are often gets turned back to the structure of the temple, interestingly enough. And why is this? And it's because the ancients knew that heaven and the inner temple were not identical concepts, but they were so genetically linked that you couldn't really have one without the other. So, without further ado, here's our select sources slide, our SSS, and this is just a few sources that we'll be using. All of the other primary sources that we will be consulting, I'll cite them in the slides themselves. So without further ado, let's jump into the material. So we'll begin with Philo of Alexandria, which for those of you who are not yet acquainted with him, he was a 1st century Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was roughly contemporary with Jesus. So what does he say about the threeness of the temple? He says, on which account it has happened that this number, 3, is a thing of great importance, inasmuch as from an incorporeal substance perceptible only by intellect, it has led us on to a comprehension of a body divisible in a threefold manner, and by which its own nature is first perceived by the external senses. Now, what does this mean? It might sound very cryptic. It'll make more sense if you were to go back to his book on the creation and read this whole passage in context. But essentially what he's saying is that there's a certain threeness to heaven, and we know this because we see tripartite or patterns of 3, I suppose we could say, throughout nature, and especially after the temple, which, as he says elsewhere, was modeled after the universe. In fact, I forget if it was Philo or Josephus, but it was one of the two, but they say that the temple was modeled after the universe. And actually, I know for a fact that Josephus does mention this, as he says that the curtain itself, the parochet, that it contained secrets about the universe. Very interesting stuff. We won't quite get into that today, but it is an interesting topic nonetheless, if you'd like to look into that more. Now, let's maybe get into a more explicit source, because the source from Philo isn't really telling us much about the temple. In fact, it doesn't even mention the temple at all. So you're probably thinking, well, how is this a temple source? How is this an inner temple source, nonetheless? And in some sense, it's not exactly. It is helpful, but it doesn't actually prove anything. It doesn't show us anything. All it tells us is that there's a threeness in heaven, and that this threeness is reflected on earth. So let's get into another 1st century source. This time we're turning over to the so-called New Testament, where it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord, and I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Right, so this is the classic revelation narrative that we find throughout Paul's writings. This is, in fact, the archetypal one, the epitomatic, I think would be the correct word, the epitome of Paul's revelatory experiences, as he claims. And he talks about the man who he knew 14 years ago, which I think it's universally understood that he's trying to modestly perhaps refer to himself. And he speaks about ascending into the 3rd heaven. So we know, well, if there's a 3rd heaven, there must be a 1st and a 2nd, right? And we're not told very much about what this 3rd heaven is, but it's associated with visions, right? And so from there, we can start to create more of a basis for the number of heavens debate. Are there 3 or are there 7? Right? These are the main 2 positions that we're usually presented with. And so to Paul in this epistle, he is at least presenting the view. We don't know if this is the only way that he approached it, but it's at least one way, that he understood that there were at least 3 heavens. Now we can argue, well, if there's 7 heavens, maybe he just went to the 3rd one. That's also possible. Or if there were 3 total, then he went to the uppermost one. And I think that in context, that is probably what he's referring to. Although, frankly, we don't really have enough information to go on in this epistle to determine either way. Now, as we've mentioned previously in our other presentations, each heaven has a temple. And so, as we read now in the Gospel of Philip, chapter 69, at least according to one version, one translation of it, we find that there is not only 3 temples, but there's also a tripartite nature to the temple itself. And it says, there were 3 buildings specifically for sacrifice in Jerusalem. The one facing west, called the Sacred, which is the courtyard. It's not so much a building, but it's an area that's part of the building. Another facing south, which was called the Sanctuary. The third, facing east, was called the Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest enters. And so we find that the author of the Gospel of Philip, which, curiously enough, never claims to be Philip. Some scholars say that it's a Valentinian text, others say that it's not. It definitely has very strongly either mystical Jewish elements or, as some scholars call it, Judeo-Gnostic aspects to it. But either way, this is reflecting a tradition which we basically find in the normative Jewish tradition as well, that there's a tripartite structure or design of the Temple Mount, right? There's the courtyard, there's the sanctuary, and there's the Holy of Holies. And all of these 3 are one. Uh-oh, what does this sound like? Now, mind you, I'm very adamantly non-Trinitarian, but to understand where some of these ideas may have originated from, we can see that they at least existed very early on. That, as Philo said, that there's a 3ness in heaven, that the Gospel of Philip says that the single temple had 3 parts. It's like, okay, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? It can still be wrong, but it at least has kind of a basis. And you know what I'm referring to without me even having to mention it. Regardless. So we find also, we haven't really discussed many Islamic sources yet, but let's look at an Islamic source, which basically says the same thing. Now remember, keep in mind this idea of the temple of the soul, the temple of the heart, the inner temple, right? Now keep this in mind as we read the next paragraph here. This is from Karl Ernst's book, Sufism, An Essential Introduction to the Philosophy and Practice of the Mystical Tradition of Islam. And he writes that inner sensorium, known as the heart, has multiple levels too. Its outermost part is the breast, or the sadr, the seat of emotions. All right, so here's the unitary sadr. Now, inside of this, there are 3 sections, and we're about to get into them. And he writes, within this is the fleshly heart, the kalb, the pericardium, the fuad, and the inner heart, the lub. Now, interestingly, this word lub, it has a correlation with the Hebrew word leb, or lev, which means heart, right? So you have the Arabic word for the inner part of the heart, which is the lub. You have the Hebrew word, which just refers to the heart in general as the leb. So you can see that there is a little bit of a correlation between these two. Now, getting back to this whole concept of the inner temple, we find that this is not so much an anatomy lesson, but it is to say, and maybe it's true, I actually don't know. I don't know that much about the anatomy of the heart. But it's more of a mystical teaching, presumably based on what they believe the structure of the heart to be. And so they said that there is one outer shell, so to speak, the sadr, which is the seat of the emotions. And within this single sadr, there's the kalb, the fuad, and the the lub. And so, again, we find that if there's an inner temple of the soul, or the inner temple of the heart, right? In previous sources, it's been called both. If there's the inner temple of the heart, we find that there is a single heart that has 3 components, so to speak. And notice what it says, that there are these 2 parts. There's the fleshly heart, the pericardium, which is like basically a sack of water that protects the inner part of the heart. This is what ruptured when they, at least according to the narrative, in the Gospels, it says that blood and water came out of Jesus when he was stabbed with a spear, and it was that pericardial sac that was full of water, from which water drains out. And so then, after this, what does the text mention? It says, then there's the inner heart, right? It's like the inner sanctum of the heart, right? It's the holy of holies of the heart. And so we find even in Islamic tradition, we're starting to see this idea that the heart, right, not so much in the anatomical sense, but in the spiritual sense, the psychological, the emotional sense, that this thing is a single heart, but it has three parts to it. And it is most likely building off of that earlier Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and the Ebionite tradition, right, which are all ultimately rooted in the Jewish tradition, which teach that there are three parts to the temple, and that the temple is reflective of the universe, and that the universe is reflective of heaven, that heaven resides within the heart, but then the soul can also ascend to heaven. It's a cycle, right? Not so much a cycle, but it's a circle. And what about in rabbinic literature? We keep mentioning, oh, this goes back to Jewish tradition. Oh, this goes back to ancient Jewish beliefs. Oh, this has roots in Judaism. Where? Where do we find these things? All right, so let's discuss a few very ancient sources. The first one is actually, it was roughly contemporary with the New Testament itself, and many centuries before the Quran. But we find that there is this discussion about how many temples, or excuse me, how many heavens there are. And we find in the Targum Yonasan Genesis 1:7, and the Lord made the expanse, upbearing it with 3 fingers between the confines of the heavens and the waters of the ocean, and separated between the waters which were below the expanse and the waters which were above, in the collection, or the covering of the expanse. And it was so. And so basically we find this idea being alluded to. It's unfortunately not being explicitly taught, as far as I can tell. But you kind of get the gist of it, that God, so to speak, of course, God doesn't have a body. He's not a flesh and blood person. But he, so to speak, took 3 fingers. And it's kind of like when a person is by the ocean, they're on the beach, and they take 3 fingers and they make 3 like channels, essentially. And in these 3 channels, the waves come up, and then they fill all these 3 channels with water. And so with one stroke, God made 3 channels for the water to flow into. And of course, this is all a metaphor. There's no, giant ocean in the sky. There's no heavenly beach. And if so, is God sipping heavenly martinis? I'm not sure. Or margaritas, I guess. Not martinis. But of course, all these things are metaphors for higher spiritual realities, right? So all these things should not be taken literally. What this text is trying to communicate is that God, again, symbolically, took his 3 fingers, made 3 channels for the water to flow into. In other words, for the Shekinah, for his divine presence, for existence, for creation to flow into, right? And so this is alluding to 3 different dimensions, right? And this is important because this goes back to this idea that there are 3 heavens. Additionally, in a text that comes a few centuries after this, in the Midrash Tehillim, or the Midrash on Psalms, we find this debate between the rabbis about, are there 3 heavens? Are there 7 heavens? We need some clarity on this issue. And so it says, sages say there are 3, as it says in Deuteronomy 10:14, behold, the heavens and the heaven of heavens belong to God. So heavens is plural, so it's 2, and the heaven of heavens is 1. Right? So we see that there's still that word heavens is pluralized, but it is the heaven, singular, of heavens. It's the pinnacle of the previously mentioned heavens. So there's the 2 heavens, and then there's the 1 heaven. Now this is important because the top heaven, the pinnacle of the mountain, so to speak, the utmost heaven that there is separate from the previous 2. This is important. We'll get back to this later, I promise, assuming that I don't die or something. But I guess if I did, I wouldn't be posting this. Ooh, that's weird. Anyway, so the sages say that there are 3. Others, like Rabbi Eliezer, says that there are 7, and they're called heaven, firmament, clouds, throne, dwelling place, and wilderness. Now you might say, well, how can all of these be called heavens if one of them is called heaven? Well, it's because we're dealing with translations, unfortunately. And so in Hebrew, it does make a little bit more sense. And when you study this out, you probably look back at it and say, oh, yeah, I guess I kind of see how that works out. But this is all to say that it was a very common belief among the sages, right? These are just the legal scholars. They say that there are three. Rabbi Eliezer, who is more of a mystic, he says, no, biblically there are seven. And then he gives us their names. Right? So it's very interesting. Now, the sages also use a verse from the Torah to back up their belief. And so in some sense, you can argue that biblically there are three, and biblically there are seven. And it's because ultimately the sages were looking at the same concept in two different ways. And so according to one valid interpretation, there were three. There was a threeness to heaven. But then according to another completely valid biblical explanation, there were seven. And we'll see this seemingly contradiction come up again and again. But it will eventually get resolved, so stay tuned to the end. Now, moving on, we're going to a first century text called, the date is debatable, but it's roughly a first century text called the Sefer Yetzirah, and it says, "So now, behold the stars of our world, the planets which are seven." Now, of course, this is planet in the classical sense, it's not in the modern astronomical sense, so just keep that in mind. The planets which are seven, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. The seven are also of the 7 days of the creation and the 7 gateways of the soul of man, the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the mouth, and the 2 nostrils. Which, curiously enough, if you're interested, Reb Nachman calls this the menorah of the head, right? Because there's 7 branches, so to speak. Just as the menorah in the temple also has 7 branches. And there are plenty of really beautiful and amazing teachings that we could go in from there, but we won't right now because we don't want to get off topic. So the 7 gateways of the soul of man, the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the mouth, and the 2 nostrils. So with the 7 are formed the 7 heavens, the 7 earths, meaning the 7 land masses, the continents, and the 7 periods of time. And so has he preferred the number 7 above all things under his heaven. Now, curiously, the Sefer Yetzirah, which was written almost 2,000 years ago, possibly even longer, is saying that there are 7 continents. And presumably, unless you think that there are 7 other Earths with that are just like ours, right? So, and mind you, he's not talking about the 7 classical planets because he already mentioned them, and he calls them planets instead of Earths. So there is a difference between the planets and the Earths, plural, right? He's talking about the 7 lands, right? So there's the European land, there's the African land, there's the Asian land. But wait, that's all that they knew at the time. But wait, there's more. And there's the North American, the South American, the Australian, and the Antarctic. And so somehow, amazingly, the author, or possibly authors, plural, of the Sefer Yetzirah knew that there were 7 continents, but that's beside the point. However, it is a little bit on point in that, as we said previously, that Philo said that God had encoded the number 3, but also the number 7. We covered this in previous videos, I believe. He had encoded these divine numbers, these holy numbers, into creation itself. And so we're actually finding an example of that right now. So moving on to our next source, which is Esther Rabbah, which is I suppose you could also call it Medrash Esther. In it we find Rabbi Hoshea the Great said, "It was made according to the specifications of the chariot, of the Merkava, of the one who spoke, and the world came into existence." So this is God. We're talking about the chariot throne of God. The one who spoke the world into existence, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And so it says, there were 6 stairs to the throne. This is according to 1 Kings 10, verse 19, 2 Chronicles 9, verse 18. So again, the author is consulting the Bible and drawing conclusions from it. He's also using this as evidence for what he's about to say. So he says 6 stairs correspond to 6 heavens. But aren't there 7? Rabbi Avon said that where the king resides is separate. So there are 6 steps up to the throne, and then there's the throne itself, which counts as the 7th. But notice how they count it. It's 6 plus 1. Right? This kind of goes back to our previous concept of there being 2 plus 1. Right? So the uppermost one, the top one, the one, so to speak, where God resides, Of course, God is infinite. He's permeating all the worlds all the time at every moment and always, right? He's all in all. But sometimes it's easier to talk about it as him residing in heaven, right? And so there are 6 steps up plus the throne, so that counts as a 7th because you can come to the 6th step, but if you can't be on the throne, well, then you're not a God yet, right? Because he's on the throne. So to get to God, you have to go all the way up to the throne, so to speak. And nonetheless, we find that just as there was 2 plus 1 to equal 3, there's also 6 plus 1 to equal 7. And again, we're finding that there is a biblical basis for both views. Now, continuing in rabbinic literature, we find in this next passage, there's a discussion about how to tie tzitzis, that is the ritual tassels that Jews wear to remind us to keep the commandments, the mitzvot. And so the context of this doesn't so much matter as it mentions that there are 7 heavens. That's really what we're mostly concerned with here. If you'd like to read more about this topic, you're welcome to go to these sources. That's why we cite them, so that you can go back and read them if you like. And also, it's more professional. Come on, let's just be real. Anyways, so it says, "It is taught, one who wishes to do fewer should not do fewer than 7, nor should he add more than 13, corresponding to the 7 heavens and the 6 air spaces between them." Now, this is a teaching that is cited in the Talmud Bavli in Menachos 39a, in Mishneh Torah, in Fringes 1, verse 8, and the Sefer Chinuch 386. And again, we find a very similar teaching, where it says, the 7 words in the last verse, it's commenting on a particular verse, Numbers 6:27 to be precise. The 7 words in the last verse are an allusion to the 7 heavens. Right? This is in Medrash Rabbeinu Bachya on Numbers 6, verse 27. Additionally, we find Rashi commenting on Ezekiel 28:2. So he's commenting on this phrase, a seat of God, and he says, "He made for himself in the air over the sea with a mechanism that was a replica of 7 heavens, and he sat down on the highest one." Right, so again, we're finding that there are 7 heavens, and God is sitting on the highest one, 6 plus 1, which brings us to 7. Again, here's an extra long passage here, but I think it's a good one. It comes from the Medrash Tehillim 92, and this will actually span 2 different slides, so stay tuned to get to the end of it. Really, the whole presentation, because, at this point, why not? But anyways, so let's begin with the passage here. God created 7 heavens, but he did not choose any of them as his dwelling place except the Sabbath, as it is said in Psalm 68:5, "A father of orphans and a judge of widows is God in his holy dwelling." God created 7 lands, but he did not choose any of them except for the land of Israel, as it is said in Deuteronomy 11:12. As it is said in Deuteronomy 11:12, "The eyes of God are always upon it." I created 7 seas, and from all of them I chose none except the Sea of Galilee, which I gave as an inheritance to the tribe of Naphtali. As it is said in Joshua 19, verses 32 through 33, "Naphtali, he possesses the sea and the south." I created 7 worlds, and from all of them I chose none except the 7th. 6 were created for coming and going, and 1, the entire 7th, was created for the rest and repose for the life of the world. Now notice again, there's 6 plus 1, right, to equal 7. I created 7 days, and from all of them I chose none except the 7th day, as it is said, Genesis 2:3, "God blessed the 7th day." And again, I'd like to add, so there's 6 days of the week, and the 7th, which is Shabbos, is the utmost one, right? This is just my commentary, but let's get back to the text. I created 7 cycles of 7 years, which is the Shemitah and the Yuval, the Jubilee and the sabbatical years. And from all of them I chose none except the year of release, as it is said in Deuteronomy 15:1, "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release." And anyone who observes the Sabbath, the Holy One, blessed be he, Kadosh Baruch Hu, forgives all his sins, as it is said in Isaiah 56:2, "Happy is the man who does this, he who holds fast to the Sabbath, not profaning it, and he who abstains from evil shall find favor. Now, recall that Philo of Alexandria seemed to be of the perspective that there were 3 heavens. However, we also find him the same guy in the same book, which is this book called On the Creation, or which is literally, it's just a book about the creation. It's on the creation, right? So Philo himself, he just got done talking about the 3-ness to heaven, and then he goes on to tell us that there's also a 7-ness associated with heaven, associated with space, the cosmos, spiritual worlds, right? So let's look into this and see what he's talking about. The heaven, or the horizon, is girded with 7 circles, the planets 2, and the corresponding host of fixed stars, that is the constellations, arrayed in 7 divisions. Moreover, the constellation Ursa Major, which men call the Guide of Mariners, consists of 7 stars, and besides the stars above mentioned, the band of the Pleiades is also made up of 7 stars. Now, mind you, he also goes on to speak of, quote, the divine dignity of the number 7, for each of the equinoxes takes place in the 7th month. But it's also mentioned in his book On the Creation. And elsewhere, he mentions, it is in heaven, too, that the ratio of the number 7 began, and from thence it descended to us also, coming down to visit the race of mortal men. In other words, 7 was really this heavenly quality, but God decided to take this heavenly quality, this 7-ness, and infuse the physical world with it. And so that's why we find 7-ness sprinkled throughout all of creation, why we find patterns of 7, why there's a 7-ness to our world. Not just in individual things, but for the entire planet, right? So we find that Philo loves the number 3, and he also loves 7, too. So it's like, well, that's strange. Maybe he and the rabbis were both drawing from the same material. Maybe they were both drawing from the same tradition, which interpreted the Bible to be teaching both a 3-ness and a 7-ness to not only the universe, but to the temple, to the number of temples, to the number of heavens, right? And to the number of spiritual worlds. Now, of course, each of these spiritual worlds can be subdivided into, even greater number over and over again until you get hundreds, thousands, millions. But that's not what we're here to discuss for today. Now, we started off with Philo, went to Paul, we went to some later sources like the Gospel of Philip, we touched on some beliefs within Islam, we went to the rabbis, and then we returned to Philo. And after Philo, now we are going and moving on to the Essens, or the Qumranites, right? That's perhaps the more technically accurate word, the Qumranites, because it's debated, were there Essens at Qumran, were they something else? That's neither here nor there. For all intents and purposes, we are calling them the same thing for today. But regardless, the people that were living at Qumran, they seem to have believed that there was a priesthood for each heavenly temple. And what do you mean, each heavenly temple? It's because in each heaven, there was a temple. So the first heaven had one, the second heaven had one, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th heavens all had their own temples. And what we find, curiously enough, in really early Kabbalistic literature, we find these exact same teachings. And it's because a lot of the Kabbalistic teachings, they might not come directly from the Essenes themselves. But the Essenes were actually a product, just like the Bahir, just like Sefer Yetzirah, just like all of these early Kabbalistic texts. Them and the Essenes all came from a common, ancient, mystical Jewish source, which is the Kabbalistic tradition, right? It was not written down. It was not even freely taught to many people. In fact, the vast majority of the Jewish world did not know about it, and it's because these mystical teachers did not want the information getting out in fear of heresy. Right? This is actually very common within all mystical groups throughout history, so this really shouldn't surprise us. However, we do find sudden bursts of highly sophisticated tradition emerging in certain books. So, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament, the writings of Philo of Alexandria, sometimes even in Josephus. But then also in very, very early works like Sefer Bahir and Sefer Yetzirah. And so then we have to ask ourselves, if they're all more or less agreeing, and they're highly sophisticated, again, you don't have to agree with them to say that they're sophisticated. There are highly sophisticated things that I don't agree with. But as for the Kabbalistic tradition, there are such highly developed pieces of theology. They could not have just simply sprung up out of nowhere, right? What it implies is that it had been brewing for a very long time, spilled over in the form of literature. Somebody publishes a book that they're probably not supposed to, and the information starts to leak out, right? There's too much light. In Kabbalistic language, we'd say that the light is shattering the vessels, right? The vessels can't take it anymore, and it just starts to spill out. So now let's turn to some quotes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and mind you, I'm citing Rachel Elior, the Israeli scholar, as my source here because I didn't go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls to confirm this, but I am assuming that these sources are correct, given that scholars do tend to properly cite their sources. But because we want to be even better than them, I highly recommend that if you have the Dead Sea Scrolls with you, feel free by all means to go back and double check this. We'll try to make it right if we can, right? Either with a pinned comment or even better yet, just read the comments. Go down and leave some comments yourselves. Let's have discussions. But regardless, let's get into these two sources here. And we read that there are 7 priesthoods in the wondrous sanctuary for the 7 holy councils. And elsewhere, we read that there are 7 mysteries of knowledge in the wondrous mystery of the 7 precincts of the Holy of Holies. And so again, this is implying that there is now a 7ness to the temple, and a 7ness to the priesthood. And there's a 7ness to the heavenly priesthood. Oh, isn't there a 3ness? Well, yes. Well, isn't there a 7ness? Yes, there's both. Is there a 21ness if you multiply them? I don't know, maybe there are. I don't know. I've never seen that before, but it would be super cool if there was. So let's get into now the children of the Essens. Well, they're somewhat the children. They were the Pharisees and the Essens got together and produced the Ebionites, right? The Evionim. And so these were basically the earliest Jewish followers of Jesus. We're not going to get into them right now because there's so much content that we could go through. Maybe I'll make a video on this sometime. I don't know. Still considering it. There's so much juicy information I would really like to, but regardless. So we know, at least according to Epiphanius of Salamis that lived in the late 300s, he said that lots of Essenes joined the early Jewish Jesus movement. That is the Ebionites, or sometimes they're called the Nazarenes, right? And so he says, the remnant of the Essenes who live in the area beyond the Dead Sea, right? So this is possibly the people at Qumran. We don't know. Their views probably were not that different, really, if at all. But this is linking, again, the Dead Sea Scroll community with the Ebionites to see what the earliest followers of Jesus really believed, at least after a certain point. And he says, the remnant of the Essenes who live in the area beyond the Dead Sea, now, however, they have been united with the sect of the Ebionites. And so what does this tell us? Tell us that when all of these Essenes moved into Ebionism, that they brought along their beliefs, and that eventually these beliefs were probably incorporated into broader Ebionite theology, which is to say what? That when the Essenes believed that there was a 3ness, or when they believed that there was a 7ness to the number of heavens, or the number of heavenly temples, right? There's one temple that corresponds with each heaven, that these beliefs were migrating into Ebionism, that eventually the followers of Jesus came to also accept these ideas. Now, it's also possible that they just believed them before the Essenes got there, right? That's quite possible. Again, these ideas were already floating around at the time, and we find evidence for it in a certain Nazarene text, or Ebionite text, called the Acts of Thomas. Now, for those of you who say, that's Gnostic, that's not Ebionite, okay, whatever, but it's a source, right? I consider it Ebionite. You don't have to, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, in the Acts of Thomas, it again mentions 7 temples, and it mentions 7 heavens by implication. So in this text we read, come, and this is, again, it's referring probably to the Shekhinah. It's a little bit iffy. It's definitely controversial. But the text goes like this. Come, she that reveals the hidden mysteries. Come, mother of the 7 houses, that thy rest may be in the 8th house. In the 8th house, again, remember, there was always a tradition that there was 2 lower heavens and then a third, right? So 2 plus 1. There was always a tradition that there were 6 heavens plus 1, right, to get to 7. This model of heavens plus 1 seems to have made its way into the Acts of Thomas and into Gnostic literature as, oh, well, the Jews say that there are 7 heavens, and then they also probably heard, and then there was, oh, well, you take all the heavens then plus 1, so 7 heavens plus 1 gets to 8. 8! So there's not just 3, there's not just 7. The Gnostics and the Judeo-Gnostics and the Jewish mystics of the Jesus movement anyways, some of them believe that there were 8 heavens, right? Because there is the 7 heavens of traditional Judaism plus 1. Again, it's this model, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 6 plus 1 equals 7. When you're told that there are 7 heavens, oh, well, there's 7 and then plus 1. So there must be 8, right? So we can see how sometimes these ideas evolved over time and produced new or innovative ideas, as we're now seeing in the Acts of Thomas. Now, this is all very important, and even the idea of an 8th heaven, while not necessarily finding an explicit source in the Jewish tradition, does actually borrow from certain Jewish ideas. So, for example, the reason, if you've ever seen the infinity symbol, right, it's a sideways 8, right? This is based on mystical ideas. This is based on the idea that 8 is the number of infinity, and therefore of divine perfection. So then, by extension, it's also referring to timelessness, right? Because if you have forever and everything's always perfect, then you're living in a state of stasis, of absolute perfect stasis, of unchanging timelessness. Coming to the rest in the 8th house, as the Acts of Thomas mentions, means to obtain eternal rest. So once you ascend to the 7th heaven, then after that is quote-unquote the 8th house, right? It's the 8th heaven, it's the 8th temple, it's the eternal rest, right? So once you get past the 7 heavens, you enter eternal rest. Once you come to God, who is seated in the 7th heaven, once you come to God, then you get rest, right? It's 7 plus 1. God's in the 7th heaven, you come to God in the 7th heaven, right? You come to the 7, then you get something else. You get an additional thing. You come to God in the 7th, then you get your rest. I don't know. I feel, I feel like I'm trying to vastly over-explain this. It makes sense to me, but I don't know. I've studied a lot of Gnostic literature. I'm probably too inundated with this stuff. And just to clarify things, I'm not a Gnostic. I'm just Jewish. But anyways, so continuing on the same slide, we find that Rabbi Eliezer Posner, he writes in his book, in Kabbalistic teachings, the number 7 symbolizes perfection, and perfection that is achievable via natural means, while 8 symbolizes that which is beyond nature and its inherently limited perfection. So we find that 8 also points to transcendence. It's even transcending perfection. It's like the perfect perfection, or the ultimate perfection, or super perfection, right? And so you can kind of think of it like this. A perfect tzaddik, perfectly righteous person, he meets God at the pearly gates, and he enters heaven. He's at the highest heaven possible. That's the 7th heaven. Becoming your soul, reabsorbing back into God, rejoining God, because the soul is divine. It's the peace of God. It's a chelik Elokim. When it returns to God fully, just like if we were to fly directly into the sun, right? That's being reabsorbed back into the sun. That is the 8th heaven. That's the 8th house. That's the 8th temple, so to speak. Anyways, I think that we've gone far long enough for today, but I did just want to include another little list of sources here where there are 7 heavens or 7 firmaments mentioned. We find them mentioned in the vision of Isaiah 5, the book of Adam and Eve 35, the Apocalypse of Abraham 19, verse 4, and then there's also the Reuyot Yechezkel, which is extraordinarily difficult to find online, so I've included a link, which you can see on the screen, and if I remember or feel like it, or both, I'll try to also do so down in the in the description for the video as well. So, in summary, Jewish sources speak of heaven in two different ways. That should be abundantly clear right now. There are three, which are actually more rabbinic. When you study it out in greater depth, you'll find that it's actually closer to being rabbinic. And it reflects the structure of the Temple Mount. And I say that this is the more rabbinic one because it's more ideas that are drawn, it's more symbolically true, in a sense. So the rabbis said, oh, well, the temple is an image of the universe. It's the image of heaven. It's a reflection of heaven. And there's a threeness to the temple, so there must be a threeness to heaven, right? So this is the rabbinic logical deduction that's going on. So that's why I say that the threeness to heaven is more rabbinic. The seven heavens are biblical. They're all named in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And so while it might seem counterintuitive, when Paul talks about ascending to the third heaven, he's just referring back to his rabbinic education, right? It's not, strictly speaking, biblical, because it's not found in the Bible. You can see it alluded to in the Bible, but it's not explicit. It's not obvious. You need to do a little bit of digging. Whereas the seven heavens, they are explicitly named. They're all listed out. And so we can find them explicitly mentioned in the text. Both the three and the seven structures explain the same reality, but in different ways. Alrighty. So now this is very important because moving on, we will be referring back to some of these concepts in future videos when we get into the Islamic sources, more rabbinic, Kabbalistic, and Hasidic sources, and to infinity and beyond, I suppose. All right. So it's been a pleasure doing this video. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, first of all, if you made it all the way to the end, that's amazing. Mamish, thank you so much. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time.
Like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the ride. We're living online in the blink of an eye. Like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the ride.